also start recording myself. Um, I'm Sam Reynolds, and I'm here to talk with you about steering around the bending of the lunar nodes. So I'd like to welcome you here to also make sure that you, just as a regular NORWAC, you're in the right room. You're like, no, I didn't mean to be here. So this is what we're talking about. So my goal is to help you be a better navigator of the lunar nodes. So I want to outline 3 points of focus for today's presentation. What are the bendings, first of all? And then to go back and make sure we're clear on the lunar nodes in terms of what they mean and at least giving my sense of the meaning. I've tried to be integrative and draw in various meanings, but I want to at least draw that in. So that's another goal. And then to talk about examples and give some examples of understanding more about the bendings. So what are they? So what you're seeing is, well, a replica of my chart minus the planets and everything else. You're seeing the lunar nodes in the image on your left-hand side. And then you see the north node at 27 Aries and 25 minutes. And then you see the south node in the opposite point at 27 degrees Libra at 25 minutes. But then you see on the right, the image on the right, you see that there's another line that is connecting between 27 degrees roughly and let's say 25 minutes of Capricorn to 27 degrees and 25 minutes of Cancer. So we're looking at that axis as yet what we can call the bendings. So literally, what we're talking about as the bendings, they are jointly the other arm or axis to the one established between the north and south nodes. Symbolically, as an axis, that speaks of a crisis for the planets or points that fall along it. So when we say that a planet or a point like the ascendant or the midheaven or the part of fortune or the part of spirit is at the bendings, we're talking about literally falling planets or points that are falling along that particular axis. Oh, one other thing, even though I have a mutable rising, I'm not that mutable. I have a lot of fixity. So if you are chatting with me, I am not seeing it right now because I want to focus on the presentation, but I will take questions afterward or if we have a lull so that we can go over it. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, the moon. This is a quote from Arthur C. Clarke. The moon is the first milestone on the road to the stars. And I want to talk about the moon's role in understanding the bendings because I think that's pretty much, a key point of understanding in looking at the bendings. So at the bendings, the moon is as far from the earth as it can be. You might say, according to Dr. Lee Lehman, then that she, the moon, is most withdrawn from earthbound processes and simultaneously most engaged in her own functions. So you can say that when we're talking about the bendings, there's almost like a pause, there's a withdrawal, as she says, but there's something that is shifting, turning. So there's a way in which things are in transition. To understand that and look at that in a correlation to other things is that we're really leveraging latitude when we're talking about the nodes, or I should say the bendings. What's a key determining factor with the lunar nodes is the moon's relationship to the ecliptic. This is different from the equator and different from declinations. So I want to make that distinction very clear. So the ecliptic, just to recap in case no one knows, because I don't know everyone's starting point in terms of coming to this conference and starting with astrology, the ecliptic is the imaginary path of the sun around the earth. Its distance from the ecliptic, and we're talking about the moon, is its latitude. When the moon is conjoined to the ecliptic exactly, that's when the moon is conjoined to either the true north or south node. Now, you may have seen something in your ephemeris or something when you kind of got a printout. There's something called the mean north and south nodes. But when we're talking about strictly in terms of the moon being exactly conjoined to one of the nodes, it's going to be more so at the true node. So that's really important to understand as the measure of distinction. When the moon reaches its maximum latitude of 5 degrees and 17 minutes, either north or south of the ecliptic, then it is either at the north or south bending. So that gives you a clue, if you have a means of looking at latitude, of understanding what's happening. So I can't resist. I see there's a lot of activity. Oh, okay. In terms of the chat. Oh, you're just giving information. Cool. This point then marks a critical juncture for change, like a change of season, whether we're talking about the moon or another planet or point, like the ascendant, the midheaven, or any of the other points. Okay. So I'm using an illustration here. Again, this is from my own chart. And I want to kind of point out that you can see two things are interesting about, the moon, my moon here, is that it's near to the point of being, far above the ecliptic at its extreme latitude at 5 degrees and 11 minutes. So it's just 6 minutes shy of that. And it is also out of bounds at 24 degrees and 40 minutes. Again, that's in relation to the equator. The latitude is in relation to the ecliptic. So that's one way, and why I mentioned this is that that's one way in which, if you're looking at the latitude, to kind of cross-check, double-check if the moon, and I'm only speaking about the moon, that's important, I'm not talking about every planet, if the moon is at the bendings. And the moon is, deemed usually the second most important planet. So it's really critical to look at that and check that out. Now, we're going to talk about some other ways in which we can draw significance for the other planets at the bendings, but I just wanted to start off with the moon, as Arthur C. Clarke said. Now, here's the part that I find both confusing and intriguing. In reading over the years all the different things that are said about finding the bendings, here are some common descriptions for how to figure out the bendings. So I'm going to give you at least 2 different descriptions, and then I'm going to give you one other one, so 3 descriptions by which to understand the bendings. And then in the chat, I'm just curious for, S and G, just to tell me which one you find the simplest. And I'm going to tell you what my opinion is, but we'll go with what I have to present first. So planets are points that are 90 degrees square the nodes from either the south or north node is described as being at the bending. So the south bending is 90 degrees clockwise, for those who don't remember that, clockwise from the north. And so clockwise, remember, is just going the way of an analog clock. The north bending is 90 degrees counterclockwise from the north node. So you're really looking at the north node, and you can decide, going with, if a planet's at the south bending, if it's clockwise, and if it's counterclockwise from the north node, then it's at the north bending. Okay. We're going to look at that in just a second. The other way in which I have described it, or seen it described, so we might as well go here, is to say that, now I don't want to assume, but the key thing to know is that the nodes move backwards. So this particular node at 27 degrees Aries has come from this particular point, and this is again going counterclockwise, going against the movement of the clock, has come from 3 years before around 27 degrees Cancer, roughly around 3 years. Similarly, this point has come from 27 degrees Capricorn. Remember, it's going to go this way. Same here, it's going to go this way. Okay, so what I used to say is that one way to describe the node's movements was to say, like, oh, imagine where the node has come from, and then you can know if it has come from, if the north node has come from this particular point, then it is at the north bendings, the point where we have the place where it's come from. The same thing will be true for the south bending, conversely. So those are 2 descriptions for it. Until, in my Jupiter and Virgoan way of looking for ever more simplicity, I realized a very simple thing, so bear with me. If the north node, if we move the north node, however, you have to use your imagination here. to the ascendant. You imagine it as the ascendant. The point that is at the north part of the chart is the north bending. The part that is at the south part of the chart up here is at the south bending. Boom. I don't have to remember clockwise and counterclockwise and all these other things in order to figure out where's my bending. Sorry. So you get the idea that I think this is the simplest way. So let me go to the chat. I'm curious, is that simple enough? All right. So yes. Leslie, yes, Leslie gives the thumb of approval. Maria, and then Daniela. Yes. So Whitney, yes, and you're going to get examples for sure, Emily. Okay. Yes. And Matthew says yes. So this is the simplest way I have found by which to figure it out, rather than going to, and you know, I'm going to give you some resources, and I'm not, you know, shading anybody really, but there's some of these resources where they describe it this way: 90 degrees clockwise, counterclockwise, and just kind of feel like that image. But which way is north or south? Which way is up? So we have this image that comes together to talk about the nodes. So this is where I want to talk briefly about the nodes, because to really get the full value of understanding the bendings, I think it's important to at least have some modicum of understanding about the nodes themselves. So here's my take. And again, this is just a refresher, just to give you an image of looking at the nodes, the movement of the moon and the sun as intersection points. And to explain now, what does that mean? The moon's north and south nodes are not physical like planets, in case no one knew. They're not. You can't go up. Anyone ever told you, like, I saw the nodes in the sky? They're lying. It didn't happen. But mathematical calculations based on the intersection of the moon's orbit around the Earth with the apparent orbit of the sun around the Earth, which is what we call the ecliptic. So that's what you're really looking at. Now, the next point is where the moon's node rises above the sun's orbit is called the north node, or the ascending node. Where it descends is the south node, or the descending node. When a new or full moon is within 17 degrees of the nodes, roughly, there is a solar or lunar eclipse. So if we're talking about a full moon, it's going to be a lunar eclipse. If we're talking about a new moon, it's going to be a solar eclipse, if it's within roughly 17 degrees. So that's just a little bit, and, you know, like to draw in what I've been talking about, that's partly where we also get the idea of eclipse, the word, from that intersection point along the ecliptic. All right, so we have the idea of the nodes and what they mean in terms of, oh, I didn't realize I hadn't shown those slides. My bad. All right, so let's start off with understanding a little more about the nature of the nodes in relation to each particular one, starting with the south node, the dragon's tail. The south node, also called the dragon's tail, both east and west. So it's called Ketu in Indian astrology, and we call it the north node here, but it's also called the dragon's tail. The analogy I like to give for the south node is that it's like the vacuum cleaner of the cosmos. Like if you hear that sucking noise in the cosmos, it is the south node. It is the filter agent of the cosmos, retracing retracting what's in this world, like sucking it out. So from a modern point of view, it highlights karma from your past, including your past lives, your immediate past, or the past of your ancestors. So it does have some connection. Sorry, didn't mean to advance it there. It does have some connection to the idea of the past, but it goes beyond that dimension, to also including your ancestors, the past within the scope of your life, for example. So that's one way in which you can look at it. So yes, I see. I guess I'm going to answer some questions. Tracy, let me answer that toward the end, and also so I can answer that. So 27 cap is no, 27 cap would be, in that particular example, would be the south bending, because it's in the south part of the chart. Okay. The south node is how you're learning to preserve key elements or key character traits that have developed or overdeveloped. So that's one way in which I designate or talk about the meaning of the nodes, okay, in terms of the south node specifically. You have come to rely too much. Another way we can look at the south node, you have come to rely too much on the traits of the south node. So you will have to push for newer associations and activities of the north node. Often the south node can be neglected. So that's another kind of contrapoint, because we focus too much on restoring north node traits. And that can manifest in our daily life and connections, the ways in which we experience life and the people to whom we're connected. Why certain people are drawn to us or certain things keep happening with particular people. The south node is said to have the traits of Mars and Saturn in more the Western tradition, and it's powered by the power of the moon. The north node, the dragon's head. Called the dragon's head in both Western and Eastern astrology. And we could say this is the influx of energy from the non-physical realm, like central heating or air blows in heat or cool air. And I like that parallel because I lived in the brownstone for a number of years in New York. And those of you who are not acquainted with brownstones, most of them do not have central air. So I moved into an apartment in my new home in Newark, and we had air and we could have like the heat on. We moved in winter, so we definitely wanted the heat on. But what I didn't know when we first moved in is that there's a filter at the front part of the apartment that if it hadn't been changed, it will shut down the whole system, because that's the part that filters the air. So that became an analogy for me with the front part of the apartment that filters it, more like the south node. And then in terms of the influx of energy and air would be more like the north node. The other way we can talk about the north node is from a modern point of view. It highlights the dharma, or the sense of righteous actions of what you're cultivating or need to cultivate in this life. The north node is the conscious intention to restore, as versus just to preserve, with others, key character traits that have been damaged, neglected, or underdeveloped. One other thing I've noticed from my practice and years of studying is if a planet or key point like the ascendant or the midheaven connects to the south node, then the north node conversely feels like we're pushing 100-pound rock up a steep hill. It's more like we have to work extra harder to restore and develop and cultivate the nature and power of the north node. The north node is said to have the traits of Venus, Jupiter, and it's powered by the sun. So that's just to help your framing and understanding of the nodes. So what we're looking at is really a balancing between restoration and preservation. I'm not going to read everything that's there, but it's kind of one thing I like to focus in on is restoration is an act to renew or repair something that's been damaged or fallen into disrepair. Preservation is an act to maintain or safeguard against damage or disrepair. So one way in which you might look at this is like this chair. Your north node highlights those traits you must work to restore in you that have been damaged. So if you found that on the street and it really was jacked up, was missing a leg, you would be doing the work of the north node. If you had that chair and you had restored it, you would work on preserving it. And you must do the work in you that is good and preserve that and not suffer from overuse of it. Now, why I divided the nodes this way is because in my own studies, I noticed something, whether authors intended this or not, where it seemed to position the south node as bad and the north node as the thing that you really need to focus on, rather than looking at the duality and recognizing that they highlight a dynamic where we need both. And you can work on preserving and restoring, in terms of the ways in which you can develop, but not to lose sight of the gifts and the power of your south node, because you want to focus on your north node. And one way in which I've come to think about this is like your dominant and non-dominant hands. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm a righty, as statistically most people are in the world, right? But here's the thing. That means my less dominant or non-dominant hand is my left hand. So I make the comparison of my left hand as more like the north node. My dominant hand would be more like the south node, because I have it developed and it's very strong. That doesn't mean then that I suddenly then forget about my south node and put it behind my back. It means that I keep it, I preserve it, I keep its strength, but I should also focus attention on developing more my south node. So for instance, Lord forbid, if I broke my right hand, I would be SOL. I would need to work on developing my left hand so that I could be useful and type and do the things that I need to do, see clients, whatever. So that's one way to think about it. One other illustration I can give you is that in an earlier life, I didn't say former life, in earlier life, I was a boxer. My father was a fight trainer. And one of the things he did, I didn't even realize he was doing it, is that he trained me. I don't know how much you know about boxing, but most people do something called jabbing, which is you kind of keep your opponent at bay with one particular hand, your less dominant hand, and then you use your hard-hitting other hand, your dominant hand, in order to kind of deliver the punch. Okay. Well, he trained me to be able to jab with both. So what I would do when I was boxing is, because I would be tricky, I guess, I was consistent in life, I would switch up on an opponent. I'd be jabbing with my left and hit with my right, and then I would suddenly switch up and become like a southpaw. And that would throw people off. On some level, I'm saying that we, in our ways of fighting through life, might do well to do what my father was trying to teach me, is to kind of keep up with both hands. I don't mean literally fighting, all right? I don't want anyone to be like, Sam was encouraging fighting during his talk. That's not what I was doing. But I want you to get the idea that it's more so of developing the idea of the north and south nodes. So let's come back to the bendings. And let me do a quick check-in, not just in terms of time, but also, let me go back. Where's the chat? See how people are responding. I got, right, okay, dog bite. Cool. All right, so people are following along. Great. All right. Understanding the south bending. A planet or point near the exact point of this bending, and I don't mean exact, I'll clarify that in a minute, but roughly in that same sign or around that degree, are said to be early on, they're weak in life, meaning that there's some way in which there's some measure of weakness in terms of the expression of that planet. It possesses an exaggerated sensibilities of the planet and expresses itself awkwardly with all things worldly and physical. Now, you might ask, why is that? Remember what I said about the south bending. It is that sucking noise in the cosmos. It is that vacuum, right? And one thing I love from Indian astrology is that they don't position, especially at its best, the idea of the south node as a bad thing as much as a very spiritual thing. So it's more so where you have to pay homage or you are connected to the spiritual world. So a planet or point at the south bending is learning or relearning, navigating itself in the physical world. So it comes out with some measure of weakness. This is something that's interesting because it may mean that this is going to cause some measure of difficulty in this person's life, and they actively have to work on overcoming this difficulty. And when I say actively overcoming, I mean that it's overdeveloped or in some way it's kind of taken up too much space in their psyche. And so there's a need for sacrifice, discipline, reworking, or having a greater concern for others. So it's more the idea, and this is where I'm taking a quote literally from my other former life as a preacher. Yeah, I went from boxing to preaching. I really did. So the idea was, to whom much is given, much is expected, as Jesus said in the Bible. So it's almost that with a planet at the south bending, you're expected to surrender more because you have more in some sense. You have an abundance of it. And that doesn't mean like, oh, well, then that means I have an abundance of something that's good to share. Not necessarily. It may mean that you have an abundance of things that you need to let go because they're no longer serving you, or they're getting in the way of your spiritual evolution and growth. The north bending, a planet or point near the exact point of this bending, are early on boosted with energy, a sense of attachment, even entitlement, I'll come back to that, to things worldly through the significations associated with the point or planet, and possesses an exaggerated sensibilities of the planet as well. So both can deal with a certain exaggeration. That's because they're focused. There's a focus to them. Like, it's almost like the cosmos, like, pay attention to those two, okay? Or if you have those 2 points or one of those points. But there's more energy. And when I say there's a sense of entitlement, this is also a very keen lesson from Indian astrology, where we look at planets at the north node specifically as putatively good. We say like, oh, this is a very good thing. This is what helps us grow, where we can also forge some sense of new paths and developments in our lives, and all these other things that are associated with the North Node. But the spiritual nature of it from an Indian point of view is that the more that you're dealing with this influx of energy from the other world, is that you're forging more an attachment to this world that binds you to karma, that binds you to this world. And that's why I say, like, you get caught up in, what we say in Islam, the dunya, the world. You get caught up in Maya, if you want to talk about it from a Sanskrit Indian point of view. So this also can come because the planet, the nature of that planet is entitled. It can also come with a sense of entitlement and feeling like, well, I should have it. So what I think can happen is that when I say a planet that is at this particular bendings, that it's also underdeveloped, this is where you also need not just encouragement, but courage, genuine courage, not just cockiness, which is not the same thing. Just not the sense of like, well, I have this. It's diligence, it's vigilance, it's paying attention. And what I would say, a cultivated patience in adversity. You're given this extra energy, this restoration, this power from the other world in order to be able to do more with it, to grow. It's a boon rather than a bane. The ego is always looking to find something. The spirit can see what's already there. So it's where you're looking at the North Node or the North Bending, you're looking from the eyes of spirit rather than the eyes of ego. So let's talk about some examples. Let me do a quick check-in also in terms of the chats, see what we have. All right, so Sam, can you show a slide with the South and North Bendings again? Yes, I can. Lost in the sauce. Does that mean you're lost in the sauce, Daniela? So let me know. Oh, you like okay, you've been using the toilet analogy. Okay. Oh, she's referring to something else. Okay. So let me go back before I go forward. And so again, what you're looking at here is up here, the South bending. And then down here, you're looking at the North bending. And this is simply because you can position the North Node, and mine does happen to be close to the ascendant, but you can imagine pushing it there, going clockwise, going clockwise, pushing it up there. And then the point that's going to be 90 degrees away from it, and at this particular point, then you can see at the North bending. Up here, you're going to see at the South bending. Okay. And I see someone has asked a question about transiting planets. I will definitely answer that question. It's coming up. All right, so let's go back. And let's get to some examples. All right, so I want to talk about Bruno Fernandes de Sousa. And for the recording, even though you also may be able to view it, he's born December 23rd, 1984. The time is approximate. I do not have a time for him. It's at 6 a.m. and it's Ribeirão Vermelho. My Portuguese is really not quite advanced, but that's where he was born. So let me tell you about Bruno. I'll read to you some measure of the the key aspects of his story, because I first came across Bruno's story on Twitter. I think it was sometime, it must have been 2016, I want to say. And that's pretty critical, or maybe it was, no, it's 2017. So let me read a little bit about him. On June 9th, 2010, the athlete's former mistress, Eliza Samudio, disappeared. While pregnant, she had claimed that Bruno was her child's father, which she could prove after her son was born. When he refused to support the child, Samudio has sued Bruno during a time when a lucrative transfer to AC Milan for him was being negotiated. After Samudio's disappearance, her child turned up with Bruno's wife. In July 2010, a Brazilian judge ordered Bruno's arrest. A 17-year-old cousin of Fernandes de Sousa told police that he had taken part in Samudio's abduction with his friend, with his friend. He also stated that Samudio was dead, but did not say how she died, nor where her body was, and that Fernandes de Sousa was the father of her baby, despite him being married. So what happened is that he ended up going to prison. He tried to commit suicide twice while in prison, waiting for his trial to begin, but the Secretariat of Rio de Janeiro denied that Bruno had done so. Anyway, long story short, according to police, Bruno's teenage cousin stated that Samudio's body was cut up and some parts were fed to the dogs while other parts were buried under concrete. Bruno confessed to organizing the plot. Now, you might say, like, well, damn, Sam, you found like a really extreme story. This dude like had his girlfriend cut up, took the baby, gave it to his wife, and he went to prison, right? No. Yeah, he went to prison. Watch this. In February 2017, this is how I heard about the story. After Fernandes had served just 6 years and 7 months in prison, his lawyer filed a petition of habeas corpus because of the slow processing of an appeal request. Basically, he was let out of prison, out of jail, pending an appeal, and then immediately got a sports contract to play football. He's a football player. I'm sorry, I left out that fact. And when I say football, I mean in the real sense that most of the world means it, which is what we call in America soccer. So he went out and started playing soccer, at least for, it seemed like would be like, we thought forever or forever long he could play. So when I heard about this, I was like, that's crazy. I have to see this man's chart. I don't even understand how this really happens and what was going on with his chart. So there's a better ending to the story. In April 2017, Brazil's Supreme Court ordered his rearrest, or at least there's a better ending. He did go back to jail, but I will tell you now, he just got out. Oh, I forgot, and then I'll move on. He said about this, he said, what happened. I made a mistake, a serious one, but mistakes happens in life. I'm not a bad guy. People tried to bury my dreams because of one mistake, but I asked God for forgiveness, so I'm carrying on with my career, dude. guess he said that in Portuguese. So why are you looking at this? Because you might be wondering. Let me look at the chat because I'm sure y'all saying something juicy. Um, like, oh, right, okay. So what I want you to note is that his north nodes and south nodes are along the Taurus axis and Scorpio axis. So north node in Taurus, south node in Scorpio. Almost exactly to the within a degree is his Mars. So his Mars, now if we were, just to give you the method I introduced to you, if we were to move his north node here, the Taurus north node, to the ascendant, that would put his Mars in the southern part of the chart, which means that his Mars is at the south bending. I thought this was, especially with it being exactly square, we don't have to know this man's birth time. That's going to be true almost the whole day. Why I think this is a significant point of the chart, and I'm going to contrast this with another chart, is that this is someone who really needed some measure of, I would say, remedial help, some means of really some conditioning with the south bending of his Mars. Meaning that, going back again to some meanings that we talked about here, where it definitely is weak, I would definitely say it possesses an exaggerated sensibility of itself. And he's not really learning to be in the world fully, especially dealing with anger and his emotions. He is an athlete, so he's expressing some aspect of that Mars is very highlighted. But in terms of how he's dealing with it as a human being, you know, I think having your girlfriend cut up, taking her baby, and I don't know, we don't know how, you know, if she delivered the baby naturally, or I don't even want to really conjecture. I think that's heinous, you know, and I'm owning my judgmental sensibility. Y'all can judge me if you want. Be like, you should be more spiritual and just let it go. I'm not there yet. I have to be where I am. So I think he's fucked up from the floor up. So, and he's out. But he's useful here as an example of looking at Mars in the south bending and how we might counsel a particular client, where we might draw some more attention to how they can work on their Mars proactively and, importantly, positively. So we can contrast this with Drew Barrymore. And let me just see what some of you are saying in the chat. This is actually great. What sign is your... People are asking about, what sign is your North Node and where's your Mars? Oh, you're talking about Emily. I thought you were talking about me. Okay, I'm about to talk about that in a second. I have Mars in the bending. I'm trying to figure out which one. So here we go. And Emily, we can talk about that when I take questions. So Drew Barrymore, quick example, just to look at her nodes, first of all. They're along the Sagittarius and South Node axis. So she's actually having, later next year, she's going to have what I'd say a lunar node opposition, because her north node is in Sag, her south node is in Gemini. So we can see, by virtue of this, that her sun is at the north bending. Now, yes, you do see the south bending up here, but one way in which you kind of can figure this out quickly is if we have the south node at the ascendant, and then we have the sun in the southern part of the chart, really, this is automatically going to be more so the north bending, because we can reverse this, put the north node over here, south nodes over here, then the sun is going to end up below the horizon. Okay, so that's the key thing to know, because it's going to be the sun in Pisces. So what's interesting about Drew, for those who know of her, I don't know, she hasn't made a movie in a while, but she made a lot of movies in the, I would say in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s, is that she started off as you know, she's the granddaughter of John Barrymore. And so she comes from an established an American acting family. And she started off acting, but she, at a very early age, including a movie you may or may not have seen, it's very dated at this point, called Firestarter. That's where I first saw her. But because she went into the industry so young, she also was exposed to all of the ills of the industry. So she started drinking and also becoming, dependent on substances and having substance abuse like coke at an early age. So that by the time that she was a teenager into a young adult, she was strung out on drugs. So some measure this you can see in terms of Neptune being conjoined to the North Node, but the sun here, meaning where we have the sense of our identity, ego, the presentation of our intention, even though it's at the top of the chart, by virtue of also being at the North bending, which suggests this is where she can focus, encourage courage, and develop some aspect of herself, and starting with a stronger sense of self, not just in terms of the roles she plays, which she did. And that's how she's actually been able to beat her substance abuse and have her life back. We have over here on the right-hand side, we have David Data. David Data is born March 18th, 1958, 6 a.m., Cleveland, Ohio. By the way, Drew Barrymore is February 22nd, 1975, 11:51 a.m., Culver City, California. So with David Data, if you're not familiar with him, he is an author, and he writes a good number of books on intimacy. I heard about him from a book called The Way of the Superior Man. Do not just judge the book by the title. It's not about positioning the superiority of men in the least, but it's more a guide on contemplating deeper aspects of masculinity. And it's written for men in understanding the idea of being truly in touch with the intimate power of masculinity and being a man. So what's interesting about him is that we have, again, if we bring the North Node to the ascendant, we go this way, we can go also this way, right? Then we realize that Mars, right, because he also has his Mars directly actually at the bendings, his Mars also ends up in the northern part of the chart, which means that it is the north bending. So again, you move your, just imagine that you're moving your North Node, and then that's going to push down the Mars and ends up in the northern part of the chart. So that's, to write a book on masculinity and looking at it from a superior or spiritual point of view, that would be a very good use of the Mars. Okay, 2 other examples, and let me just check the chat, and I think we're still good on time. Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, she started acting when she was 4. She was very young. Okay. I think you figured it out, Emily, with some support from each other, so that's great. See, this is interesting. This is something, I'm a Norwakian for the last, I want to say, this is my 5th year. And, one thing that I've never had during a presentation, I'm sure Nicholas can attest to this, is that most people are quiet until the very end, or unless you allow some engagement. But this is really cool because I can see like active live engagement. So I'm just talking about the offset. Even though many of you are not getting the live experience of a conference, you're getting something else. So it is something different. Yet I think just as powerful and interesting. Okay, let's talk about the sci-fi fantasy author. Chart is given with his permission, January 18th, 1980, 8:27 a.m., Cambridge, Massachusetts. So again, we look for the axis of the North Node to the South Node. And then what we see square to that is Uranus. Uranus is at 24 degrees, Scorpio, 47 minutes. Now, a few things about this author. He's a New York Times bestseller. You might ask, like, well, how can you tell that from the chart? Well, one thing that's interesting, because he's also a client of mine, is that with that North Node at Regulus, which is a fixed star and one of the most powerful fixed stars in the heavens, I was like, this augurs well for you establishing yourself in the world. Remember, it's a mixed blessing with the North Node. And when we talk about the North Node being a mixed blessing, meaning that it gives a certain sense of attachment into the world as we know it, which sounds great. Like, yeah, I want to be famous. I want to be on the New York Times bestsellers list. that sounds good. But then it kind of fixates you to that world. And rather than the idea of moksha, which is liberation, in terms of spiritual liberation. Anyway, we can position the north node here, and then the south node conversely goes over here, which will push that Uranus below the horizon, which becomes the north bending. I mentioned this example, and I think it's very fitting because it positions that Uranus at the north bending, and he's a sci-fi writer and fantasy author, and the idea of dealing with novelty and speculative fiction, as a measure of focus. And of course, there are other factors we can look at. We can look at Jupiter ruling his, Mercury ruling his Jupiter. We can look at Saturn also being in the same sign, ruled by and being in mutual reception, and also trine to his Mercury as symbolic of success as a writer. But I think what really stands out in terms of the kind of writing that he does is the Uranus. All right, then we have this guy, me, November 22nd, 1967, 1:19 p.m. There's a reason why I'm using my chart, because it's when I have my own permission to use my own chart. And also, it highlights something from my life. So you'll see that the North Node is here in Aries, and then we have the South Node in Libra. And that that would mean that the Mars is at the South bending, like Bruno, right? Well, and then we have the Moon at the North bending. And you might remember that my Moon is both out of bounds and then also at the highest or near the highest latitude going toward the bendings, which means during that day, it is also a correlation to it really being at the bendings earlier in that day. I also like to point out, because I think this is just interesting and then related to what I'm about to share, my astral twin is Mark Ruffalo, literally to the day. I don't know the hour in which he's born, but he is also my astral twin. So in terms of the parallels to our charts. Now, why is this important? Well, one, let's start with Mark Ruffalo, and then I'll come to myself. What's interesting to me, and I laugh about it all the time, is that there's an exact trine between Mars and Pluto, and Mark Ruffalo's probably his biggest money maker, I would imagine, especially being in all those Avenger movies, and then also being known as the Hulk, dealing with an angry, green character who pounds things, and he even says in one of the movies, "I'm always angry," which is not necessarily about his whole life, but I think that is symbolic of that Mars at the South bending. And correlate to that, it's dealing with the Pluto, which deals with the rage. Now, back to myself. Now, some people have told me I'm a pretty affable guy. Some of you know me on Twitter, so you're like, yeah, whatever. But I think of myself as an affable guy. But when I was younger, meaning that when I was in elementary school, the reason why my father put me in the ring, I was always fighting. I was always getting in fights. Either I was picked on because I'm, those who haven't met me in person, I'm relatively short. Well, I'm not relatively short. I'm goddamn short. I'm really short. I'm short for a man. I'm 4'11" short. So, I was no bigger when I was a kid. So either I would have to kind of stand up for myself, or because of this Mars, I felt like, well, the best defense is an offense. So I would pass by the bully's desk and be like, your mama, get in a fight right in the classroom. So my father thought, despite the fact, and I'll just mention this as an aside, having multiple birth defects and problems, despite my mother's protest, yeah, I'm gonna put this boy in the ring. One way to solve his issues to discipline his anger and discipline his Mars, which he did, and he saved my life. And when I say he saved my life, I mean, I haven't been in any circumstances where I've had to fight for my life since I was a kid, thank God. But I also didn't have to prove myself through my Mars anymore. I knew I could defend myself and take care of myself. So when I'm talking about a planet being at the South bendings, I'm talking about it needing help. You might say, then what was the work with the Moon? Well, it's dealing more with my emotional expression, dealing with honing more of my emotional expression, whether it's kind of learning that through counseling techniques to be an astrologer, or through the expression of being an actor, or through the expression of being a minister and counseling and dealing with people's feelings. So that was one way in which I was able to hone and develop the north bending, and then kind of tamper and redirect the south bending. All right, I see a lot of chart activity. So,
Hey Sam, I just wanted to mention something. Sometimes you'll say here as if you have maybe like a cursor over top of your screen, but we don't see a cursor at all. So I just want to
oh,
let you know there's
thank
a bit
you.
of confusion. We just have to figure out where you're at when you
I
reference
am so
something like that.
sorry. Thank you for that. All right, thank you. Yeah, because I'm looking at something else. So let me change that since we're coming toward the end. Now, can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I was looking here. So thank you for saying that, bringing that to my awareness. All right. So here is the moon at the north bending. Here's Mars at the south bending. Now, why is that true? Because the north bending, or I should say the north node, is, if we push it toward the ascendant and it's on the same side, then whatever is above the ascendant, what is above is going to be in the southern part of the chart, the south. And then what is ever going to be below is going to be in the northern part of the chart. So my moon is at the north bending and my Mars is at the south bending. Okay, I hope that clarifies now that I can point to where you do that. Okay. All right, we only have a few more slides, so I'm almost finished. You can apply the nodes to a lot of other things too. I'm talking about natal charts, but you also can do the same in terms of looking at it with horary charts. So I'm showing one horary from, let me just get back here. I'm showing one horary on the left that is from Lee Lehman's The Martial Art of Horary Astrology. And then there's one of my favorite horaries, my own, on the right-hand side. So what we have over here is, you see the moon positioned between Jupiter and Mars. And the question is, will I finish the course? And it's for April 9th, 1989, 8 a.m., San Francisco, California. Now, the question in terms of will I finish the course, just to give you some background, is that there's a woman who had signed up for a correspondence course, and she was having some difficulty with the teacher. And she wasn't sure that she would finish the course, and she was getting testy with the teacher. So she just really was like, is there going to be like a resolution to it, or am I just going to drop out? Well, let's look at the nodes. So we can see that the north node is here at 3 degrees Pisces, and that the south node is at 3 degrees Virgo. If we take the north node and put it down here at the ascendant, that means it's square to Jupiter, the moon, and we could even throw in Mars, but mainly Jupiter and the moon, goes to what we call the northern part of the chart. It goes below the horizon. So that means that Jupiter and the moon are at the north bending. Now, one thing to take into account with horary, and this is very important, is that the bendings in horary isn't so much about like, oh, some critical point of development, as much as it's a critical point. There's a crisis point at which we're arriving. And so the moon beautifully illustrates that she has arrived at a critical point in terms, because the moon in horary, kind of just to give a quick horary lesson, the moon in horary is kind of the co-significator of the person, and also showing where the action, the energy is moving in a chart. So with the moon being at the bendings coming from Jupiter, which could also symbolize the teacher, going toward Mars, it would indicate that roughly in about 9 weeks or 9 months, because sometimes it's hard to figure out the timing for things with horary, this was going to come to a close, and that she likely would not finish the course and bail out. And the correspondence course, however long it was going to last, if it lasted longer than 9 weeks, she probably wouldn't make more than 9 weeks. Turns out she survived the course for 9 months, but she still dropped out. So that's the critical point. Now, the chart on your right for January 28th, 2012, 5:45 and 30 seconds in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where I had cast the chart. This is one of my favorite horaries, and let me tell you a little bit why. First, let's look at the nodes. The north node is at 12 Sag. The south node is at 12 Gemini. If we position this node here to the ascendant, the planet that ends up square to it, in terms of challenging along that other axis, is going to be roughly Venus. And we also see Mars. So Mars and Venus are roughly widely square. You might say like, well, that's about 5 degrees and then 10 degrees. I'm going to talk about orbs in just a minute, just to give you some general principles, but I don't get too attached to that. And I think 5 degrees is ample enough for that Venus. Now, the question is, will she do time? It was a client, suggested here, who was asking about her firstborn daughter. Her daughter had been arrested with credit cards in her possession that did not belong to her with the intent to commit fraud, which, as you may know, is a felony. So my head was telling me before I cast a horary, I'm just letting y'all know, I'm just talking astrologers to astrologer lovers and students, but in my head, I didn't say it to my client. I was like, oh, she's screwed. That's deep. You got busted with the cards in hand, and that's a felony? Like, it's no way. It's like, oh, blah, blah, blah. Well, I did the horary. Now, what the horary tells me is that this exalted Venus is at a critical junction, even though with this Mars retrograde, but it was really the Venus that drew my attention, because the Venus and the Jupiter, the ruler of the 5th house of children, I don't want this to become a horary lesson, but we're looking at the child as the key point. And we also have the North Node being conjoined to signifying the child. Venus and Jupiter are in mutual reception in terms of each other's signs, because we're using classical rulers and Jupiter's a ruler of Pisces. We also have an exalted Venus. And this Venus actually is in the north bending, because if we move the North Node here, Venus ends up below the horizon in the northern part of the chart. Now, I won't go through all the factors I looked at, but I even had to call my horary teacher and be like, hey, look at this chart for me, because I'm actually looking at it. No, but okay. Hi, Nikki. So I actually looked at this and was like, I had to call my horary teacher and say, well, I'm seeing that she gets out, but here's the conditions under which she's been imprisoned. How does she get out? Like, how does this even end up as a good story? So I actually told the client what I was seeing, and that, there's maybe a way in which she can work it. And also if she has a good lawyer, I think there's, a chance. Now, I wasn't just trying to give her false hope as much as what I saw in her horary. She got out. Not only did she got out, and this is interesting in terms of the Venus-Mars, she was arrested with her partner, her boyfriend, who was also her partner in crime. She actually wasn't the focus for the investigation or for the DA. It was her boyfriend. So as long as she was willing to, I'm just telling y'all how it went, as long as she was willing to drop dime on her boyfriend, they would drop the charges against her. And so they did. So that was interesting, because having that Venus at the north bending seemed to augur that and working in her favor. So what are some points of consideration? Some things to kind of really think about as you're in practice working with the nodes. It's important to think about planets or eclipses that are also transiting at the bending of someone's natal nodes. So if you're in a session and you're looking at you know, for instance, 29 degrees, for instance, yeah, you know, you're looking at 29 degrees, the axis right now of Sagittarius and Gemini. You want to see what planets are at the north and south bending. So we would position, you know, the north node at the ascendant, which would be Gemini, and then we would see that Virgo would be at the north bending, and then Pisces would be at the south bending. So that's something important to pay attention to. Also worth noting, paying attention to, are how transiting nodes position natal planets at the bendings. So you might also think about the transiting nodes, right? Well, I guess that's the point I was really making. But you also want to think about no, both of those two things. In general, I don't think orbs matter when it comes to the actual nodes themselves. But if you really want to kind of stick to the idea of orbs, with lunations in general, I'm comfortable with giving an 8-degree orb. So here are some more opportunities for researching on the nodes. So one thing I haven't discussed that I'm also curious to do more about is exploring similar concepts to planetary nodes with each planet's respective nodes. So one thing to know is that Mercury has its own set of nodes. Venus has its own set of nodes. Every planet has its own set of nodes. What's frustrating is that they don't work necessarily in the same parallel as the lunar nodes, meaning directly opposite to each other. They can be in different signs. So, but one thing I haven't looked at are the bendings of Mercury's nodes or things like that. So I don't even know how that might be done, since Mercury's nodes might be at different places, but that is something to research and look into. Here's some things if you want to take a screenshot of this. Also, you get the PDF. You could look at Mary Plum's article on the nodes, Lee Lehman's chapter on the nodal cycle in her book, Classical Astrology for Modern Living. I highly recommend Judith Hill's book, The Lunar Nodes. And then I also highly recommend Kathy Allen's book, When Worlds Collide, Another Look at the Lunar Nodes. In short, though, crisis can become opportunity. The bendings can illuminate where to focus our attention for awareness and growth. Our perception becomes our power. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, we are at time in terms of my presentation. You can find me on Twitter, and thank you, Marcia. You also can find me on Facebook, and find me at unlockastrology.com, or book a session or connect with me at unlockastrology.com. All right, so thank you, everybody. All right.
I've got a few questions for you, Sam.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so there are a couple people who are a bit confused in terms of the cardinal directions and how they're identified in the horoscope. Are you able to clarify that?
Yes. Let me go back to the original slide. All right. So this is east. This is west. This is south. This is north. So when we move the node to the eastern part of the chart, to the ascendant, that automatically positions the south node to the western. Then what we have above is going to be the southern sky, or the southern part of the chart, and then the northern. Now, I know this is confusing, and you might say, like, who the hell thought this up? Why? Why is that there? So it's an interesting question. Why aren't we positioning it like we normally do? West, east is over here, west is over here. It's because there's a general theory about this, and the idea is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in my next lecture on the part of fortune and part of spirit. I'm talking about the invisible points, this NORWAC, is that we talk a lot about the Greeks in the development of astrology. We talk a lot about the Babylonians. We don't talk enough about the Egyptians, the Africans. And I think that's important because one contribution of the Africans, the Egyptians, is that the arrangement of east to west in terms of how we look at it, the construction of the houses, is unique to something because as I know it, the Nile is one of the few rivers, if not the only river, that flows from the south to the north, right? Is versus going from north to south. So we look at the West as being symbolic of going toward the setting sun and death, and we start off with the East. We're also starting with the East because that is the place and the idea of the rising sun. So there's two reasons. One, I think, is more historical, that's overlooked often, especially in the construction of houses, and the other one is just in terms of the actual movement of the sun.
Okay, what else? Somebody asked about the orb that you use.
So yeah, I use, when we're generally talking about the bendings, if you have, so for instance, I might not talk about, if I had other planets, let's say it at 3 degrees Cancer, I might not necessarily say that's exactly at the bendings. But I say, as long as it's close to 8 degrees or even 10 degrees, it's within orb for the bendings. I wouldn't get too rigid about that, but that's the general sense.
Next question. You made a comment about the moon moving towards the bending in your chart. Can you clarify this?
Yes. So I'll do it 2 ways. And it's moving away from the bendings, but it's still at the bendings. So there's 2 ways to look at this. One is that my moon, maybe a few hours before I was born, had moved into Leo. It is at 5 degrees and 11 latitude. That's important because what I told you is that when the moon moves to the extreme latitude of 5 degrees and 17 minutes, then that positions it at the bendings of one of the nodes. That's literally what will happen. Now, my moon is actually moving away from the bending, so I'm sorry if I misspoke and said moving toward, but it's still at the bendings, even though it's not in the same sign or along the same axis as it. Going to my actual chart to illustrate it. Sorry, I have to go through this way. Here we go. You can see that at 27 degrees, this is actually just 5 degrees away from my nodal axis of the north and south node, 27 degrees of Libra and 27 degrees of Aries. So it's just 5 degrees from that particular point. So it is moving away, but that means it's still technically at the bendings, both at latitude and also by within, orb, if I gave it an 8-degree orb. So that's why you have to be careful and not go like just by sign.
Okay, and then the last question is if they could contact you for clarity on this topic. And I think you gave your contact information. Maybe
Yes,
you could share that one more time.
Yeah, it's unlockastrology@gmail.com is where you can write me. And also if you want to talk about it on Twitter, I'll be back on Twitter. What's the day? The 22nd? The night of the 23rd. I'll be back on Twitter. I know that sounds strange. Like, what's wrong with you? It's Ramadan, and I took off for Ramadan. So Ramadan ends Saturday night.
Okay, here's another question. Anything notable about the transiting nodes to the bendings of the natal nodal axis?
Yeah. So, for instance, I know it's going to, for me, it hits my Uranus. I think it's going to be really important to pay attention to the shifts with the nodes, and especially as it's angling toward an eclipse, because at some point it may even hit that point. It's interesting with eclipses. So for instance, let's say for the sake of argument that you have a Uranus, I think this is possible for someone to have, Uranus at 28 degrees Sag, then, it's definitely going to be lit up. Not necessarily, pretty much this eclipse that's coming up, I think June, the one that's at 0 degrees Cancer, I think that's June 21st. I think that one is definitely going to be powerful. And if it's at the south bending, right, in your chart, or if it's especially the south node is going to be on, let's say, your Uranus, then it's going to be dealing with some way in which you have to sacrifice, some way in which you have to like let go of something. There's a surrendering whenever we're talking about the south bending or the south node, rather than kind of like if you have like a strong sense of attachment, or if you're doing it just for your own personal gain and ego, then this is where you can run into trouble. One example that Judith Hill gives in her book that I really like is talking about the south node connected to Venus. And it was about an artist who kept losing or having her portfolio stolen. So it's only when she decided, this particular artist, to start giving away her art or find some way in which she's offering it, surrendering it, that kind of stopped. The more that you have a fixation on the planet or issues related to the planet at the south bending or the south node, the more it will cause you pain, the more it will cause you trouble. Okay. Any other questions?
We have about 4 minutes left. We could maybe take one more. There was one in the chat. I haven't read it through, but.
How about transiting nodal axis reverse the nodal node axis? Yes. Natally is at the north bending. Does it become a south bending point with the transit? Let me just see that in my head. It doesn't. Bendings only work if there's something square to that axis, right? When you are having like a reverse, what I call a lunar node opposition, you are experiencing not so much things at a bending unless you have some other planets that are operating along that same axis. It just becomes a lunar node reversal, which I talk about that, especially at the 27th. Oh, okay, natally the planet is at the bending. Yeah, then that's going to be really important. And let me just see. I would say start with your natal chart and the bending that it fits. So if it's at the north bending, yes, it will be at the south bending with the transiting movement. But really, it's the focus in your natal chart rather than just by the transiting chart. Because this is going to happen, several times in your life. Like the biggest lunar node opposition is at 27 years old. So when I say the biggest one, it's like the biggest one in adult life. This is where we also have the idea of the 27 club, where we also have lost people. So it means it's a significant time where you're evaluating your sense of connections and sense of purpose, and how you often can express that in terms of the world, and trusting that you can realign yourself with the people and events and circumstances that affirm your sense of purpose. Natally, the planet is at the bending, so does it affect differently when the nodal axis is reversed? It just highlights it. I wouldn't get too focused on that, because it's more so, again, your natal chart. So if it's at the natal north bending, focus on that in terms of the north bending. Don't get too caught up in the transiting aspect of it. So for instance, like my Uranus doesn't, at 28 degrees Virgo, it's not at any particular bending in my natal chart. So it's definitely going to be a lot more susceptible to this bending between the Gemini and Sagittarius axis. Cool. Thank you, Sarah.
Hey, buddy. It's Nicholas.
Oh no, it's Saturn. You've come to pull me off, haven't you? It's the end, isn't it?
I have.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
Well, thank you, everybody. We're finished.
Thanks, Samuel. Great job.
Thank you.
Great job on a topic you don't normally see in an astrology conference per se, and you don't. I haven't the way you did it. So appreciate it, Sam. I'm always appreciative of you.
Thank you.
In the astrology world, and you are a major piece of Norwalk in my mind in the last so many years.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, definitely, Samuel. Everybody here, I have to thanks for showing up. starting the process here. In order for me to download the video, I have to close the room out. I'm going to be opening it up within minutes here. Just you can come back in, getting ready for the next lecture. Okay.
So come back in about 2 minutes, because
as soon as I
come
have
back in
it
the
up.
room and
Yeah,
mingle
if
a
you
little
want.
bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to stop this recording here because I'm saying this on record. But let me stop this. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Yeah, everybody, I'm going to reopen the room. So use the same link if you want to come back in. Okay.
All right.
See ya.
Bye.